My name is Chinmayi Balusu, and I am the founder of Simply Neuroscience.
What inspired you to create Simply Neuroscience?
It came from my own experiences, really. When I was in high school, when I was around 15 or 16 years old, I really fell in love with the brain. I loved all things neuroscience, and especially brain anatomy because there's so much going on. But found that, especially pre COVID, there weren't really a lot of opportunities to get involved as a young brain enthusiast. I think most of the programs or opportunities out there were restricted to college or higher ed, grad school. You had to have a PhD for many of them. And so, with that in mind, I basically set out to go and try to find opportunities out there on the internet and then to share with other peers around my same age as a way of learning of it, then giving back as well. And it really took off once I started posting online into social media, and a lot of folks who were also early career came across the platform and really resonated with it and wanted to build a community together. So that's really been at the heart of the organization in the 5 years since then. Is it's really at the end of the day about learning and creating opportunities and resources together and giving back and mentoring too.
What is it like working with people who have similar mission as you?
I think it's absolutely energizing because sometimes I think with being early career folks or with building nonprofits and the range of responsibilities in between, it can feel sometimes really tiring and sometimes really frustrating. You run into a lot of roadblocks and challenges, and you feel lost and confused and concerned at a lot of times. And I think having peers and colleagues and as a support system is really important. And it's been the absolute joy of my time with volunteering too, because there's always people who have a really fun idea and you want to share with someone and you have someone. So you can bounce back and forth a lot of ideas and energy. And I think it's just really exciting when you have multiple people come together and then you get to build a really cool product or some sort of final result and then have memories from it that will last many years to come too. So there definitely has been that collaborative atmosphere professionally, but then also so many of the individuals that I've met over the past few years, I've grown to get to know as friends and as very close supporters and cheerleaders of one another too. So that's been absolutely joyful.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your organization?
Absolutely. So, Simply Neuroscience at its core is entirely student, trainee, and volunteer led. And from across the world, we all come together to basically compile and curate resources of all kinds that are helpful for young folks that want to go into the neuroscience field. So, it's kind of a lot of the community and audience that we serve is basically they have this interest in neuroscience, but they don't really know where to go from there, especially because I think for a lot of students who may be first generation in higher ed, or even first generation to the sciences too, it can be a little bit confusing on how exactly to navigate the field, especially because it's evolving and growing so quickly. So we try to curate resources, and what I mean by that is, for example, a student-produced podcast or a Humans of Neuroscience series, an online mentorship program where you don't necessarily have to be located in a certain geographic region, but you can still seek advice from experts. These more virtual community and gathering spaces, conferences, guest lectures, fireside chats, basically kind of a one-stop shop for all things neuroscience-y, and especially one that is very youth friendly. So we're not talking intimidating jargon out here, and we're going to keep it at the basics and really explore kind of what that path is like. So
Yeah, that's interesting what you said about youth. What is it like to, you know, not speak the same language that people have been speaking for 15, 20 years
yeah,
to get people more excited about it?
exactly. I think that, especially with neuroscience growing so quickly and in so many different directions, I think there's kind of been this struggle of what perhaps was a traditional path in neuroscience 5, 10, 20 years ago is not the case for students today. And one of them is that obviously there's a lot more opportunities available now. For instance, even when I was starting college in 2019 compared to now, there's a lot more career opportunities and degree paths for doing things like neuroscience and journalism. that was definitely not something that was on my radar 5 years ago. So I think in terms of the language and in terms of framing, I think that with the entire goal of Simply Neuroscience is to kind of build this foundation and a framework where then you can use that little toolkit and then take that off into the world in whatever direction you want to be. So, regardless of if you consider yourself maybe a hardcore neuroscientist, you want to win the Nobel Prize for something physiology or medicine related with your lab research one day, or you want to be a neurojournalist or someone who's in public health or policy, um, it's okay if even neuroscience isn't your actual on your college diploma, but you just have to kind of know how to interface with it because I think a lot of learnings from the neuroscience field tend to trickle out into a lot of different areas. So, thinking about misinformation too, how do we combat that? And maybe how can students be a part of that mission and movement to try to bring science responsibly out from the lab and the research environment to the general public? So, I think that concept of language and the kind of framing that we use in this area is evolving day to day. For example, neuroscience and society is now kind of a new growing area. And what does that landscape look like? And what does the really end vision of that look like? So I don't think there's a lot of clear pictures, to be honest, right now in terms of what that end product looks like. But I think that trainees, especially in this generation, the next generation, the 10, 20 years that come, are going to be driving a lot of the interdisciplinary angles forward. So I guess we're going to have to stay tuned and buckle in our seatbelts and see how that goes.
Yeah, for me, I live with bipolar disorder too, and I talk to a lot of people to get their lived experiences because that makes me, feel good, feel I'm not alone.
Mhm.
But there's also the other side of people doing the science, the research, and all that. How important is to combine both those elements?
Absolutely important. I could use all the synonyms there are essential, absolutely crucial, everything. I think that sort of those bi-directional relationships, that's a word that I saw used a lot of times in grad school. I was a public health student, and the entire core of my studies was that we can't just develop something in the research clinical world
Right.
and then expect that it's just going to get out to the public somehow. That's not going to happen unless we have bridge building actually formally take place. And I think that a lot of times too, there's such wonderful cross pollination when scientists and innovators sit down and actually listen to folks who have lived
Yeah.
experiences. Because one of my more radicalizing moments was realizing that one of my mentors, who was an Alzheimer's disease research scientist, had never actually met someone with Alzheimer's in his life. And it's kind of heartbreaking to think about that because to know exactly how these all these molecular mechanisms in scientific journals are going to translate to have a day-to-day impact on someone's life, what are the kinds of medications that they might choose to take, and how are the symptoms going to affect their life? Can they hold a job? I think there's just such beautiful power in the human stories, and especially being able to gauge, at least on the research end, someone's actual needs living with a certain condition or struggling with mental illness of any kind to learning exactly what their challenges are on a day-to-day basis and then using that to inform our work. I think that speeds up our research and our impact 10, 20 times fold. And it makes sure that we're not really opening up rabbit holes that are irrelevant and that we, especially in a world where funding and time and resources and everything is limited, we're actually focusing on the most important issues relevant to the people who may benefit from something later down the line. So I think of it as overall, those kinds of bidirectional conversations make sure that all of the lab work and the research and the clinical work is not just obscure, but it is overall trying to account for how multifaceted people are and how people's conditions and health varies so much and try to do good. Really make sure that impact is interpersonal and yeah, has a face to it.
It's great just talking to you and hear your passion about it. Uh, do you feel that younger people are more open with their feelings, which then helps, use empathy in this research?
Absolutely. I think also there's a lot more excitement of not just neuroscience, but STEM students and early career STEM professionals in general to think about more of the humanities. And we're seeing growing areas like narrative medicine, for instance, which is focused on the whole physician-patient relationship and storytelling at its core. And there has been absolutely exponential growth, which is incredible. I think also thinking about more structural level change that's trickling down to a lot of young folks is in actual curricula. I think thanks to the efforts of some really amazing faculty members across the US and across the world who are not only assigning students to go read this book, go do this assignment,
Yeah.
but are encouraging more hands on experiences too. For instance, one of my courses was called Contradictions of Care, and it was about caregiving. And so one of our assignments was to go and tune in to a Zoom call that was focused on art and interpreting art for individuals with dementia and their caregivers in the same room to kind of see how caregiving dyads worked. And it was so powerful because it's one thing to read something and it's
Right.
one thing to see something. So I think those kinds of integrating more of those hands-on experiential opportunities into education on the structural level is amazing and incredible. And we're seeing a lot of reciprocity from the students as well to take part in those. So thinking of even course feedback surveys or even all of the extracurriculars that students are taking part of outside of classrooms. Getting involved in nonprofits, doing outreach work themselves, even while they're still in training, especially social media advocacy work too. I think there's I think the next generation really values storytelling and a lot of that face-to-face aspect of the sciences. So absolutely, Michael. I think that we're seeing a lot of energy and it's continuing to grow too.
Have you seen the people you work with your organization gain confidence as they go through the process?
Absolutely. And thinking about, I mentioned some of these extracurricular opportunities that students have been a part of. I
Yeah.
mentioned, for example, volunteering with individuals who have Alzheimer's as one, but also in various, I think, mental health advocacy spaces too. For instance, I think about how a number of my peers are involved in research and policy and advocacy efforts for psychological conditions or mental health conditions that they themselves also have. And we think about, for instance, depression, anxiety, and all these different issues, which may seem so far away when they're talked about in news headlines, but a vast majority of my peers struggle with those same conditions going through school. And so I think there's just such incredible um, growing interest in wearing both of those caps and hats of I'm a person with lived experience, and I'm also going to use those experiences to then advocate as a science communicator and as a researcher and tell you about why this publication matters, why my research matters. So I think that I definitely see that sort of a person themselves who has lived experience also becoming a researcher and an advocate and a scientist and a really amazing neuroscience professional. And I think also with more students volunteering out in the community, for instance, when I was in college, a number of my peers and I got together to organize spaces for individuals who had suffered traumatic brain injuries. And it was very much one of those opportunities where otherwise we would not have really had chances to connect with them in our community if we weren't to organize and sit something and attend other settings together. So I think that there's definitely a lot of that connection happening in terms of students going out and seeking those kinds of opportunities themselves too. And I'm really glad that, again, kind of like alluding to that structural aspect, it's also being incentivized for students who may be hesitant about where to get started. So I think we're seeing change on both a youth-led scale and then also a structural scale that's trickling down. So again, I think it's just a beautiful balance point where everyone is meeting in the middle.
What do you do to help your own mental health?
I would say definitely time management and specifically knowing and learning how to say no to things. I'm very much the kind of a person who will take way too much on my plate because I want to say yes to everything. Everything sounds exciting, and I also don't want to let people down by saying no. So I've been trying to be better about setting those kinds of boundaries. And that also trickles down into, for instance, with Simply Neuroscience itself and with running a nonprofit and also being a student and a trainee of knowing, okay, when do I need to prioritize something over the other and making sure that I'm not overbooking my schedule. And I think the aspect of something that I'm trying to learn and continue to learn in 2025 is being really transparent about saying, yes, I can do this, or no, I can't do this, without feeling shy. And I've just noticed that saying no has helped me improve my own mental health so much because then I don't really feel as much of a baggage of, oh my gosh, I still have 100 things to do at the end of my day, but rather I feel very happy concluding my day knowing that I've achieved all that I can and I still have time to relax. And I'm a big reader, books here. So that's like what I've been trying to do in terms of trying to stay mindful of my schedule to then think about mental health in my personal life as being healthy too.
I agree with you because I always try to say yes because I
Yep.
like helping people, but
Mhm.
there's times where like, all right, this is too much. I can't think straight.
I know, I know. Yep.
So where do you want to see your mission, say, in the next 3 to 5 years?
Mhm. I think I really want to see this approach of near peer mentorship continuing. And what I mean by near peer, just to explain to our viewers,
Yes.
is not just thinking about a mentor as someone who might be 20, 30 years out from where you are in your career, as someone who's really senior and then imparting knowledge to you, but rather as someone who's maybe only a step or two ahead of you, only a few years away in terms of your own career trajectory. So that could be someone in college who's being mentored by a PhD student who's a few years older, someone who's maybe a postdoc who's being mentored by someone who recently started a faculty position, or even in general in the nonprofit space too, just maybe like a 4 or 5 year gap in career stage and trajectory. And why that's important is obviously you're both growing together and you're going to be failing and struggling and learning together. And I think, especially again, with times really changing quite quickly, and a lot of changes happening in the short term, I think that perhaps sometimes wisdom from 2, 3 decades above where we are or from later where we are can sometimes feel a little bit outdated or the system has completely changed in between. And so I think there's definitely, in terms of thinking about more intergenerational mentorship, traditional mentorship, there is still incredible value to it. And I think just thinking about conceptual thoughts, those conceptual ideas for your career and growth, those have never really changed. But in terms of more immediate, how do I move from X to Y to Z? How do I go to graduate school and things like these? I think the near peer mentorship and finding and fostering more of those spaces is super important so you can grow together and basically have, and for the older, slightly older folks, I think it's sort of like training someone who can then become your collaborator 5, 6 years down the line. So there's just the investment pays off so quickly too. And it's kind of like I think of it as having an older sibling is what near peer mentorship feels like. So the reason I'm mentioning all of this is I think we need a lot more of it. And there's just such a wonderful trickle down effect where I've, for instance, being recently out of graduate school, have had a chance to mentor college students and high school students, but then also be mentored by folks who are a little bit more senior and established. There's wonderful knowledge transfer going on. And especially as we get more interdisciplinary and even more and more interdisciplinary in the neuroscience world, I think that having that cross pollination happen between folks of really similar career stages is going to be really helpful. And so, at least with Simply Neuroscience, what we've been trying to do is, of course, expand our mentorship program and organize more online events that at least provide an opportunity to meet folks around the same career stage. Because I know a lot of us are in our own geographic bubbles, but sometimes, the a most ideal mentor for me is not going to be sitting, 5 miles away from me. There might be across the world. So, are also organizing a lot of those spaces for inspiration to spark and hit like lightning, basically, and organizing and supporting more mentorship, providing resources for not just people to participate in our own mentorship programs, but also for them to take part and catalyze their own on a local grassroots level across the US and across the world too. So I think moving into this model overall of kind of there's all this global outreach work going on, there's all these grassroots work happening on the side on a regional level. How do we bridge the gap between them? So I think that's sort of the future of Simply Neuroscience, what I'm hoping to do, and also where I really, really hope neuroscience goes overall.
How can people reach out to you and learn more?
You can definitely, everyone, come and visit our website. It's simplyneuroscience.org. We're also on across all socials. And the most important point I want to reiterate is that if you're a neuroscience person and you know it, like that is, you live, breathe in everything neuroscience and you want to learn more, we're the place for you. If you are also perhaps not really involved directly in the neuroscience field, but you're curious about where the field is going to grow, and you just want to be a part of this movement of a lot of really excited early career folks, then come and join us too. We are really open to brain enthusiasts of all stages and all ages. And we're trying to focus and expand a lot of our more public engagement and public education information and tidbits, the kinds that you see on social media and whatnot. So we're always excited to just share and learn together.